right, well, we've made it, people. It's almost the end of the season, I think. I'm not sure that there's such a thing. I think I have young children, so to me, it's just the song that never ends. It just keeps going and going this year. And I think that sort of the trends of the trends. I wish it was because of COVID, but I don't think that's the case. I think it started maybe 2 years ago, that our seasons, our sort of traditional season of admissions and financial aid would have lived in sort of the September to March timeframe. And now it just sort of bleeds into every other month. And we have families coming in August thinking about independent schools, like the first time it dawned on them that they ought to think about where their kid's going to go to school in the fall. So we're seeing this sort of this sense of this never-ending process. And so I truly appreciate you guys giving us time on a Monday of what still feels like the end-ish of a season. So what I'm going to talk through today, so I'm the managing partner of Mission Enrollment, and what we do is schools outsource financial aid processing to my company. So we have a team of folks. We work with about 40 schools around the country, independent schools around the country, in all the different financial aid platforms. And we're essentially taking the application from the raw data that comes in, application comes in, and we know how clean those are. And we kind of scrub them, we clean them, and we make sure we have all the tax documents. We're adding back the items that need to be added back based on the school's protocols. And then we are delivering to the school the final sort of, okay, here are all your numbers. Here's all the kind of clean as one can be files. And then the schools go ahead and make their awards. We give recommendations for awards. So it's been really interesting this year to see just the consistent trends. And so this year, instead of just doing I normally do a ton of training for folks. So while yes, schools outsource financial aid processing to my company, why would I train people to not need me? That is really that's a big part of my mission. Not every school can afford to outsource. And in the last couple of years, there's been a big shift in how much support a financial aid platform can give their end users. And at the same time, I worked at NAIS when SSS was there, training was a really big part of our world, training you on how to look at things, how to look at tax documents. And this is really a big challenge for admissions folks that do financial aid, because, admissions folks and looking at, K-1s just doesn't live in the same space. And so over the years, I think it's gotten really complicated. So we're going to talk through the trends that I saw. So my base of knowledge. So we reviewed about 6,000 applications this season. And so this is kind of sharing. I worked with schools from the East Coast, the West Coast, in between, up and down, and K through 6, K through 8, K-12, Jewish, Catholic schools. So I've got a little bit of every category. And this is what I saw pretty universally, even depending on even the platforms that people are using, SSS, TADS, FACS, FAST. There was sort of some universal things that I found this year. And so that's what I'm going to talk through. Because of all of this that I saw, I thought what might be useful now that it's sort of spring, and I know we're kind of coming out of financial aid season, if you will, I wanted to share with you guys some of the things that I'm now doing to create a really solid process for appeals. That was probably the number one thing I saw in the processing of financial aid over the past couple of years. Because appeals, meaning they got their award and they said, no, thank you, I want more, or I need something different, or basically just trying to make a deal with you. That has increased before COVID. So then COVID hits, and now it's this preservation of cash, and somehow schools are the ones responsible for funding and making sure that families don't lose all their money. And so because of that, I thought it would be important to share with you the policies and processes that I have put in place for schools, so that you have a really clear guide on appeals, because I don't believe appeals are going away. And I think the more public school families we add into our mix, right? This year, we saw a lot of public school families that were new to the independent school world, and we didn't really have time to gear up for them and get them educated about what is independent school, how is it, how do you pay for it? What is the process of applying for financial assistance? Those are the things we just didn't really have as much time to do, simply because we were bombarded in some parts of the country with public school families. It was really just a matter of keeping things stable. So I'm putting together just a policy, I would say your policy guide expansion kit, right? So getting an appeal process in place while it's still sort of COVID is important, because once that hopefully goes away and we are beyond this, the appeal process to me, I don't think is going, or appeals in general, I don't think are going away. And so putting together in your policy guide an appeals process that's formalized and it's in your guide, now you just have it and you don't have to worry about kind of coming up with this next time when you have more public school families, or the increases in tuition is yielding a lot more appeals. You've got a process in place and you can kind of work through that. And then a last quick update on budgeting. Right now for my schools, the vast majority of them are asking me to give sort of a year end, where are we at? How much financial aid have we given out? What is that looking like? And so I'll just give you a quick example of what I've been using with the schools. I'm a treasurer for a school. I'm on 2 boards, but I'm a treasurer for one of them. And, from a treasurer's perspective, the things that I wanted to see from my admissions, from my business office, from our CFO, and I just shared an example of what I've been doing. So that's going to be our sort of plan for the day, for the next hour, I should say. All right. What should have been, in my mind, I was talk about being totally off my game. I really and truly thought we would be sort of out of this last summer. I was like, yep, we're going to kill this. We're going to just go through it. People are going to have temporary not being able to work, but the government stepped in really early. I think this is going to be sort of a short-term gig and we'll be back in action, unlike the 2008 crash. What I thought. I was wrong, clearly. But what I have found, though, is I think we're still in that place. We're drawing conclusions from, or we're trying to draw information from what happened in 2008 to help dictate what we think is going to happen now and the next couple of years. And to me, the big difference between the 2008 crash and what's happening now is that in the 2008 crash, we had a financial crisis, we had a stock market crash, and a housing crash. And now, while we have a financial crash, the government stepped in much earlier, and they were able to kind of provide support to the middle, or they're trying to provide support to the middle. And I don't know about you, but every time I go on Redfin and try to select a house I like, within 30 seconds, it's like, oh, it's under contract. I'm like, I have the Midas touch. Every house I look at goes into contracting within 30 seconds. So housing, at least in California, where I'm in Southern California, about 60 miles east of Los Angeles, you can't find a house that's available for more than 10 days, totally overpriced, all of these crazy things. So we don't have a housing crash quite yet, if that's going to happen. And the big thing for me is the stock market. So the families that we deal with, tend to be in the higher to upper income ranges. So they do have money and they're playing in the stock market. They have money in the stocks and they're doing wonderfully. I remember those early on messages when we did those COVID applications, when like everything first hit and everybody's like, we need to do a COVID application. So I created a quick COVID application. And then I looked back on some of the notes that people wrote. And they too were feeling, very wealthy families immediately applied for COVID aid because they thought my business is going to crash. My house is going to be worth half of what I owe. And I have money in the stock market and it's going to drop completely. And I'm going to lose my retirement yet again, like I did in 2008. And tons of those notifications that families, they write up what's going on. It's the stock market's going to crash. I'm going to lose all my money and all of these things that didn't actually happen for families. And so I think what happened was we immediately reacted. We tried to support families, which I think was incredibly important to do. But I thought that was going to be the end of it. We have identified that things are getting better. But come September of 2020, I thought, all right, we probably won't see, because we were so good about COVID aid is temporary, one time. Did I say temporary? Please don't ask again. Financial assistance. A lot of those families now filled out the regular financial aid form. So that was absolutely a connection to 2008. I thought if we were really clear about the fact that this was temporary, one time, and things were improving, then these families that were sort of never had been on financial aid, temporary situation, would not think that they needed to apply for financial aid now. And they were applying for financial aid. I don't know if you guys saw this, but a lot of those families that were just the temporary one time have now applied for financial aid. So now they're in your portfolio and we've got to do something about that. So the big observations I saw, whether with the COVID aid people or just the general population, we talked about mortgages, like everybody and their brother is refinancing, right? So money is cheap right now. So we have lots of families refinancing debt, and they're doing refis. They're buying homes if they maybe weren't sure they were going to do it. So now they're doing, because interest rates were so low. So in the financial aid platforms, it's an observation, but it's also sort of thinking forward that, a closing cost could be a sizable expense depending on where you're located. And in certain financial aid platforms, closing costs are an allowable, unusual expense. So if somebody had a refinance or a closing cost, and that's part of your protocols to allow that expense, that's a direct reduction of income for these families. And what could happen is next year when they reapply, meaning when they're going to start applying here in the next couple of months, this year, same situation, same income, not much has changed. We might suggest they can afford to pay several $1,000s more. And so I want you to just be aware, if you're thinking, what in the heck is going on? Why would last year versus this year, everything's kind of equal? Why are we all of a sudden saying they can afford to pay more? So just something to note. And if you guys noticed, you can run a quick report in whatever platform you're in, how many folks had unusual expenses and what were they? And just knowing if you allowed them this year, what you might have to do, depending on if it's a returning family or a new family, you might find yourself having to sort of ratchet people down over a 2-year period instead of a 1-year period. Because family is going to say, hey, wait a minute. Last year, I made this much. This year, I made roughly the same. Why are you asking me to contribute, thousands more? And of course, tuition went up. So, we've got just something to consider as you're thinking about, as you're planning for your next year ahead. Now, because of that, I feel like all these refinancing that folks did, there's been a lot of reprieve on student loan debt for families that have high student loan debt, and they are in certain programs. They had not had to make payments on their student loans now for quite a long time. If you weren't impacted by the pandemic and your student loans are in this sort of freeze mode, which essentially is they're frozen in time, no interest, it's just sort of a pause, right? There have been lots of people that are dumping big amounts of payments on their student loan debt to drop that down before interest rates pop back up again and they start going into it. So I think this is sort of a reshifting of income is happening. And I think we'll start to see some of those families that I'm always deeply aware of, which is that middle income group, like a family of like 2 parents and 1 child. There's just no application that serves them well. We asked them I think we really stretch that group in the $150,000, $250,000 range. They earn good money. They only have a family size of 3. And they have massive student loan debt, but they don't have a ton of assets yet. They're sort of like just hitting their stride. I think this group is going to start to improve, and we'll see that student loan debt might potentially start lowering down because of this pause that happened. So that could be sort of a silver lining of this. The other kind of opposite side of that is those that don't budget, a lot, and they came out of schooling and, they were paying $1,800 a month to their student loans. And their student loans took a pause. And now they were using that money to pay their child's independent school education. And so it almost wasn't impacting their discretionary income as much as it had in the past. Well, come October, I think it's October, those student loans go back into repayment. Guess what? That $1,800 debt is going to start coming back again. And now they're going to have to start making some more choices, and it's going to start cutting into their discretionary income. So running a report on how, of your families that have student loan debt, high student loan debt above $100,000. These are just kind of some of the things I think will be useful in the summer if you actually had time to do, observations, like as if we have any time to even think. But if you had time to do some kind of preemptive strikes, that would be one of them. Okay, the other observation I saw, which was pretty universal, was multiple new applicants applying. So we typically do the returning families, and then we, look to the new applicants, and the admissions folks tell us, okay, here's the kids that are bubbling up to the top. Can you start reading these financial aid folders? This year, I was getting, I usually get a sibling, like that's obvious. You get a sibling that's new, comes through, that's easy. You get a new family, maybe has one kid. We have twins. We have a lot of twins happen, right? But I don't often see that we have families coming to us for the first time and they've got a third grader, a seventh grader, and an 11th grader. And you're like, oh, what do we do with this? And so I saw a ton of my schools saying, hey, you got to review the Smith family. They've got 3 kids. They've got 2 kids. I'm like, whoa, what is going on? That's a lot of kids to try to place. And from a school's perspective, they're like, this is for admissions. This is great. We can fill in some of those blanks that maybe we haven't been able to fill in, some of those odd years we don't traditionally have applicants come in. But the downside of having all this influx in certain parts of the country of public school families sort of unsure of what was going to happen, if their public school was going to open again or wasn't going to open, they were disaster planning and kind of applying for independent schools, because independent schools killed it. They did an awesome job adapting, making changes, offering programs that were flexible. But what I felt was happening, looking at the applications, was that families that made really great money, I mean, they would have been a perfect admissions applicant, right? We're dying to find these people, make great money, and they live in the right school district, they're educated, all of these great reasons to have families but they weren't thinking about independent school. And in their mind, I moved to the good school district. So I paid more for my home back when I bought it. So I don't have extra money. I'm already paying for that high tax. I don't have extra money to pay for independent school. In their mind, that is extra money that has not been baked into their budget. And so when we get these multiple family applicants making $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, you would on its head think, yeah, they certainly can afford independent school. And their offers were crazy. I mean, straight up crazy business. So the offer was, a 2-for-1 deal, a 3-for-1 deal. And I found that consistent. It was sort of either the expectation was not set about what the heck is financial aid in an independent school. And perhaps they thought, well, independent schools must be wealthy. And so they've got all the money in the world to give out. And they're the Harvards of the world. And so they have endowments and all this stuff. Not totally sure of what that means. And maybe saying, well, this is my first offer is $5,000 per kid. You come back to me with a better offer. So all this sense of negotiation got ramped up because public school families were not used to the gig. And so they're coming into this, and admissions folks are so busy running around doing all their things that to take a pause and do, maybe a financial aid night saying, well, what the heck is this? What is financial assistance? What does it do? Who should apply? What is it serving? It was too late. It was already October before we started having all these applications coming in. So this became a problem because there was nothing mathematically I could do in a lot of these folders to say, yeah, there's no way they would qualify for an 80% discount. I mean, there's nothing else I can do here. If you choose to give them more, then that's an enrollment management decision, but there's nothing mathematically here to change it, right? And so schools were then put in this position of, do we want to let that, do we want to just fill these guys in, give them more financial aid than technically they should get, or do we just say, no, we gotta hold the line here, because this could be then that trend that they start talking to everybody else. This is, oh yeah, if you apply to this school, they're great, awesome financial aid, they do this, they loved my kid, they gave him financial aid. So one thing as an observation of seeing tons of that, which then increased all these appeals that I got. So I would say, no, you don't qualify. And they would say, you're crazy. I do qualify. And I would say, okay, send me your budgets and all that stuff. Like, yeah, no, the budget looks exactly like what the math does, like nothing to do here. But financial aid calculators are not really budgets. And in their mind, they're saying at the end of the month, I have $1,000 left to decide to spend it on whatever I want. And from a financial aid application perspective, we're saying, on average, across a large swath of families, we're going to protect this amount of money for housing. If you want to spend more on a bigger home or spend more on a bigger car, different things like that, that's on you, but we're not, you're going to have to make different choices. And for an independent school family mindset, they're like, yep, I know, we've made this commitment. For a public school family, if they're thinking this is a one-time, I'm going to do this once for this year, and then we go back to our normal everyday life. And I think that is something we really have to pay attention to, as this, I know it's kind of too late for this season, right? Because all these applications have come through and we're already done. But if in certain parts of our area, if there are schools that are still not open, it's still not clear what's going to happen, we need to work really hard this summer on educating these families that are with us and really ensuring they understand what financial aid is used for, what's the process, how does it go. I'm trying to bring back, we always talk about like, when are we going to go back to, normal, or what's the new normal? In my mind, someone gave me this term and I loved it. It's called the next normal. And we want to be trying to plan for the next normal. And to me, now that we have families that are very comfortable on Zoom, why not bring back the idea of a financial aid night? Now, back in the day when I would try to sell schools on doing a financial aid night, they're like, that's awesome. To be clear, nobody is going to show up to an auditorium and be seen with other families that they're considering going into. It's not going to be popular. And they were 100% correct. People did not want to be seen in a financial aid seminar, right? But on Zoom, on a webinar, it's totally anonymous. Anybody could go check it out. So kind of bringing that stuff back to, if we can start now, educating our families, and because we're going to still get more new, we are going to get some of these amazing public school families that were like, wow, this was worth it. And had I known, I may have done this years ago, but I didn't know about independent schools. And we might get this awesome wave of a media that says, this is a great opportunity, this is a great thing, and we'll keep these families. So we have to do a good job this year where we have the opportunity, because we have the benefit of time right now, and saying, okay, this spring, this summer, we are going to do an outbound campaign to really educate our financial aid recipients, our families. What is the importance of applying early? Why do we need your taxes? Why is that so important? And that the timelining of it is really important. So just doing those, kind of working with your communications folks to say, all right, guys, we got to update the website, because just simply saying, here's our tuition, we have this thing called tuition assistance or index tuition or whatever word we want to use, we need to be a little bit more, we need to make this at a fifth grade reading level, right? They say whenever you write an article, you need to make it at the level of a fifth grade reading. And that is what you need to be doing. Working with your I'm not a marketing guy, but working with your marketing folks to be super clear about what this is for and and to help folks decide, should I even bother applying for this? So long-term COVID impact is another group that I think all of us have seen, right? It depending on the industry you're in, there is just still this furlough layoff. I saw quite a few folks that worked for like Hilton, Marriott, a lot of the travel industry type folks, that they just kind of held them on as long as they could, and then they've let them go. So the timing of the long-term unemployed for this financial aid season that we just completed wasn't great, because we had families that had lost their job, long-term unemployed. The $600 they were getting weekly ended months and months and months ago. There wasn't the new version, which is now they get the additional $300 a week. Stimuluses were slow. And so how do we manage these families that under any other circumstance, they would have really no trouble, paying whatever percentage they normally pay, but their industry has been disrupted. And what do we do and how do we serve them? So I've just got a couple of quick scenarios on what I did this season. But in thinking ahead to next season, what can we be doing if we still have sort of this long-term unemployed families? Like, how do we manage it? Because we're looking at their 2020 taxes, forget about it, right? There's nothing to see here. We're going to see unemployment, and we're going to see income that's quite low. And how do we deal with those folks that we know will finally get on their feet again? And we got to be careful of how much financial aid we can give out to those families and be sustainable for the long term. So I have a couple of tips and tricks on what I did this year. I don't know if it's right. I mean, there's still a lot of uncertainty, but I'm all about protocols. I want to do whatever I do for you, I want to do for you and you and you and you, so that it's consistent. And because it's now, April, if anyone applies now, I'm thinking, okay, first quarter is done of 2021. For any business owner, I'm getting first quarter 2021. So I'm trying to get even more current information as I possibly can from families, getting a current paycheck stub or their last paycheck stub. So there are some ways that I've been trying to, instead of keep looking to the past for these longer term unemployed, I'm trying to get as close to the current state of affairs as I possibly can. And that's kind of how I've been dealing with those folks. And like I said, the increase in appeals has been just, problematic. All right, the expansion kit. So hopefully that gave you sort of an overview of what I saw. Sometimes I don't want to say misery needs company, but there are times when you feel like you're in a bubble, and that are you experiencing a lot of these same things that other schools are experiencing? And I can tell you that there was no one school that didn't have all of these same pieces of the puzzle, some more severe than others, but everybody kind of had very similar experiences. So the appeal piece, which is sort of one of those that really troubled me, because I felt like I was on my heels about it, because I would say to a school, hey, when we first work with the school, I'll say, give me your financial aid policy guide so I can make sure, like, do you add back depreciation? What do you do in the folds? I want to be consistent to whatever you did. And they'll dust off a 10-year-old policy guide, and they'll send it to me. And it looks like a brochure for parents about financial aid, is sort of the one group, where it's just sort of like, we require both parents apply. And if they don't apply, like, we require a notarized letter, et cetera, et cetera. If you're a business owner, we require taxes. And so while that's helpful, I think it's a good starting point. Because of the transitions that I think are happening now in 2021, I don't know if there's just this feeling of maybe it's time for me to retire. Not me, but those that are fortunate enough to be able to retire. They're like, listen, I've been through the '08 crash. I just dealt with this crazy. I'm retiring. And I don't know about you guys, but I am seeing on like the ISBOA boards on the admission side of the house, it's like everybody, there's like this massive amount of job opportunities. And so folks that have been in this industry for many, many, many years are retiring or moving on or going into a different type of industry. And I'm not sure why. I think some of it is probably just that folks have been doing this for 30 years and they're ready to retire. And maybe they were going to hang on for 2 more years. And they're like, yeah, no, COVID did it. Yep, we're good. We're going to retire now. And I'm worried that those gurus that we've had for years in financial aid, in admissions, in business office, what do we do when they're all leaving, and they're leaving in June, and we like, okay, what did this person do? How do they manage this? So it's really important, I think, to make sure your financial aid policy guide is kind of way more specific and internal, not your external one, your internal one, and making sure you know exactly what you do in the folders and how you can write that out in a way that if you had to hand this off to somebody, I always say, like, if I get hit by a bus, I can hand this off to somebody and they're going to know exactly what I did in those folders and how, what are my protocols? What are my processes? With most of my schools that I had been doing financial aid for now for several years, we had a policy guide, which I'm sending you guys. One of the documents I'm sharing is a copy of my policy, like a sample financial aid policy guide, an internal one, and then you can kind of adapt it, fill it in if you're needing one. I did not, and I was help managing this. I didn't have a real specific appeal process because, the school would email me and say, oh, the Smiths every year, they do the appeal, we do the song and dance, and then we get back to them, we give them a little bit more, and then we call it a day. And that was pretty much how it went. I mean, we didn't have tons of appeals. And this year we did. We had appeals for new families, we had appeals for returning families. And like I said, a lot of that was generated by families that just had not applied for financial aid, didn't know what the process was. But I was on my heels because I'm getting emails left and right. Oh, can you talk to this parent? Can you talk to that parent? For schools that I don't talk to the parents, I don't reach out to parents directly for certain schools. I'm having to like write emails, and then they're sending them off to parents. It became this crazy process. So I don't want you guys caught on your heels next year, because I feel like the appeals again is going to continue. So one of the things that I just pulled together, this is just a sample of what I did in the middle of the season to try to come up with some organization around appeals, was to put it into the financial. This is just a screenshot from my financial aid policy guide. And, being really specific, what do we get from everybody? We know that there's always that family that just appeals just for appeal's sake, but we're going to try to set this new precedent. So this is the kind of the flow that I pulled together. So we really have two pathways. Let me make sure I put this out. So we have two pathways that you can do your appeals. And I had schools where if it was really challenging, I might have a school email address. So electronic processing, like all done through email, could work. And then I have other schools that I've been working with for years, and they preferred, even though the school's families knew I existed, so they preferred a more facilitated appeal phone call. Okay, we're going to set up a call with Alyssa. You can talk through what's going on. And while they were talking to me about what was going on in financial aid, I mean, their life, I was editing the financial aid platform kind of like live in screen, not sharing it, but in screen, and then saying, okay, now that you told me your story, I'm going to need your current paycheck stuff. I'm going to need your unemployment benefit statement. I'm going to need da, 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 da. And they felt heard. They felt like I was really listening and paying attention. And for me, the electronic process is perfectly sufficient too. The problem with the electronic process is that it's a one-way street. And so I get this information and they say, well, my business is down by 50%. And I'm like, oh, I have like 17 follow-up questions for you. And if I had done a phone call, it might be just faster to do that and say, okay, what exactly, what was the business? What's going on? Is 2021 better? So you kind of have these two pathways, or you can do sort of a hybrid version of that. And so for me, what I thought was, regardless of how you do it, it doesn't mean you can't build out an appeal form. Now, I liked the idea of a form because it felt more like a process, a real process, and not like I call you and ask you for more financial assistance and you say, it doesn't look like you qualify for any more. And then they call the division head, and then the parents call the head of school, and the head of school calls you and calls the admission person. And it creates this phone chain that happens. And then we end up giving a family more simply because they've reached out to half the school to try to pitch their position. With an appeal process, even if we are going to give someone more who technically doesn't mathematically need more, we have had them follow a process like everyone else before them. And so building that Google form, and the reason I came up with the whole Google form, there was an awesome guy at Westover School, young guy who I worked with this year. And I said, oh, this appeal thing is crazy. And he's like, well, remember we did the COVID appeal application. What if we had like a Google sheet for not COVID, but just like a specific to an appeals? Why are you appealing? What's going on? Like, what are the questions you ask, Alyssa? Let's build it out. So that's what we did. We built out a Google form, and then I stole it and shared it with all of my schools, as he gave me full disclosure to do. And I'm going to share that with you. So I have a copy of the Google sheet that I created. And the nice thing about Google Sheets, if you used it for COVID, was that you actually had the ability that once you set up the Google sheet and you give that to families to complete, it actually, once they complete the form, you can have it notify you that they've completed something, because sending them back into the financial aid platform that you use is not super helpful because you don't really know when did they go in. It's not super clear at times what's changed. And I would rather be in control of that process instead of just saying, well, go into, FACTS when you get a chance and do this, or you can't really even go into FAST or TADS. Like there's limitations. And so how do we get that information and make edits and updates? And this to me felt like a clear path and process, because then I could sort of follow it. So this is a sample of so someone emails or calls and say, I'd like to appeal my award. What I'm doing is saying, okay, we're going to look at the rationale. Perhaps they put it in the email or the phone call. And I broke it out into feel free to I'm going to send you a sample of this too. You've got it. It's just a Word doc, but the components are what's important to me. The component being thanking them for appealing, not because I'm like, oh, thank God you appealed, but thanking them for being courageous to do it. Maybe they felt like this was uncomfortable or what have you. And being, as graceful as one can, knowing, perhaps you're like, oh, this is bananas. So thanking them for making the effort, and then letting them know, but because you're doing this, you are asking us to do something. You're asking us to change something. So making sure we give them clear criteria. So the next section, depending on what system you use, you can change this up. But, I want you to know as a parent, we didn't just come to this loosey-goosey. What I found when I was talking to parents, when we do the appeal calls over the phone, and I would just find myself saying, well, so in this platform, some of the things that don't really get considered are parts of maybe your student loan debt. And that's kind of what happened here. Or you had unusual expenses last year and you don't this year. And they after were like, wow, I feel like I understand this more. It feels like this, I'm filling out a million questions. I don't know what goes into a calculation. How are you determining my need? How are you telling me what I can afford? And I think there was this sense of like, oh, there is more to it than just saying, okay, 10% off, 20% off. There was way more to it. The other really important piece of the message is to say, what has changed? Because the assumption is we did it right the first time. So you need to tell me what has changed that's led you to do this appeal or this request. And for the vast majority of people, something had changed since we looked at their taxes. I mean, the timeline is terrible financially. They apply in, November, December, January. We're looking at now year 2019 taxes when everybody was still killing it before COVID. And in some cases, we're looking at some 2020 stuff. And then they're not going to pay us until 2021. So a lot can happen potentially in that time frame. For those that nothing has changed, it becomes a really awkward appeal for them because it sort of puts it on them to say, all right, well, why can't you pay it? What's going on? What do you got going on? And you get some really interesting answers. But putting it back on them to say, we have to assume that we did it right the first time. You tell us what's changed, and we will be more than happy to make an assessment of the change. So then just making sure you're telling them, and you could make this sort of generically, like, depending on the time of the year, 2020 or 2021, whenever you implement this, W-2s, 1040s, business taxes, whatever, and then a description of what's going on by completing this form. So this is the Google form. You can make it look pretty. You can have your marketing people make it look pretty. But essentially, this is the form. Go fill this out and go upload these taxes or, whatever the financial aid platform. And then the most important thing for me was to say, just because you did an appeal does not mean we're going to change our answer. And I think we need to be super upfront about that because, again, I start asking for like, oh, I need 2020 P&Ls, I need this, I need that, and this, and they sending it, and I'm not finding anything. And some schools like, they don't qualify. Yeah, they don't qualify. And then we have to go back to them and say, we've denied your appeal. So setting that expectation out of the gates, as uncomfortable as that is going to be critically important. So those are the components I use. Here's just a screenshot of the sample, the appeal sheet that I created. Very, very simple. You can make something far more complicated. You can get into the nitty gritty about like, what has changed with your taxes, go to line number 70 in tax return, or you can keep it higher level, but it works because families now are used to filling out Google forms. They're more comfortable with online pieces of the puzzle. So the one important question I think is critical is that in most financial aid platforms, we ask people, how much do you think you can afford to pay? It's the age-old question. And when I worked at NAIS, I would say from 2010 to 2018 or whenever 2018 I left, we revised that question 17 times in SSS. We added check boxes, confirm, are you sure you're confirming? You can say that you can pay basically tuition, but no, there's no way you could afford it. We tried everything. And for some reason, this question just baffles people. I don't care what platform you use. I find people just put really weird answers here. So if I don't have a good benchmark of what are they feeling like is realistic, because in some cases, when they do an appeal, I'm saying, yeah, well, they said they could afford to pay $18,000. Mathematically, they can afford to pay $9,000, but it's, and the tuition's $30,000. So it wasn't like they did tuition. So I'm going to go for it, right? So they appeal and they say, how do you think I can afford to pay that? I'm like, I don't know. You told me that. So in order to avoid that uncomfortableness, I do always want to ask, what was in your mind, what you thought you could afford to pay? And oftentimes it was like, no, I thought like, the tuition was that, and I could afford to pay 8 or 9 or 10. And I'm like, that's fair. That makes sense. Not the question we asked, and you answered it crazy, but I get it. So making sure you ask that question so you save yourself the hassle of just trying to figure out what they did or why they did it. The sample flow for me is also to just so when they fill out the Google form, you get an export, and you can create an Excel spreadsheet or a Google sheet from the form, which is awesome. And it just kind of lays out from the questions you asked. I add 2 fields. You can just add a field or what have you. And if you're going to make recommendation changes, right? So you can, this says mess, this is just my company. So we recommended that we do this. And you'll see in 2 of those, we're like, no, they don't need any more. So we had the original awards. Here's the new recommended award based on the state of affairs. What's changed? What's different? And then I do the notations. What did I do that led me to believe that all of a sudden this family that could afford to pay, $25,000 now could afford to pay 8 or 10 or what have you. There are things that make pretty sizable differences in the calculation. So just writing up the what you did and why, and I put that in the financial aid notes so that next year, when I have absolute amnesia from this season, I will remember why I made all these changes to the family's calculation. And then I'll kick myself for saying, oh man, they said their business was going to be down 50%. And I found that a ton this year. And then when he got their 2020 taxes, it was about the same, or in some cases better. And I'm like, oh man, we gave them more because they were so afraid that their business was going to tank completely, or that they were going to lose a job and not be able to get back on their feet. And they did okay, and we gave them too much. And then you got to spend a year kind of ratcheting them back down. So putting together the why you made the adjustment, and then putting together, if I use a spreadsheet that then says, okay, here are the awards, here's what we've got. I started adding an appeal award just so I personally could say, all right, we had 8 appeals or 10 appeals. Is there something sort of consistent about those families that led them to an appeal? Was it families that were a family of 4, a family of 2, student loan debt? I honestly did not find a universal common theme amongst families that appealed, other than there was a higher percentage of families that were coming to the school new as public school families. So that was really the only universal thing that I saw. So I'm not going to talk through this, but this is just to give you, you're going to get a copy of this. These are just some of the changes I made for this year's version of those that are COVID impacted, and just kind of giving folks, giving you some ideas of what I did. This year, when it was going to be like, okay, we're not doing COVID anymore, I found myself saying, but why don't we just do that? Like, why don't we, those families that are just COVID impacted and they are, they're still COVID impacted, they still don't qualify mathematically because they've got huge assets and things like that. What if we did, because they're coming out of it, what if we did one more year of like, oh, we've got additional COVID funds? And so a couple of my schools, we did that. We ended up, instead of just declining them saying, yeah, no, you're good now, we did give some COVID aid at a lesser amount. We capped it at, say, $2,500. Yeah, I think there was value in that. And for our, for the does not, those our normal full pay families, I was sort of hopeful, and I'll report back on my findings, but I'm hopeful that because we helped them through these 2 difficult years, that they won't come back for a 3rd year, because we were super clear, you are not on the pathway to needing financial aid as a normal financial aid recipient. And even using, I have this thing called the breakup letter, just even saying you don't qualify for traditional financial aid. However, we have been authorized to give additional COVID support this year because of your, you work in Hollywood and you guys were, sheltered for longer than we anticipated. And we're going to give you another $2,500, whatever it might be. The goodwill that's generated from that, I think, is going to be long-term impacts. And I think we will even see families a little bit more generous with giving to annual funds in the years ahead. Those that we sort of supported during this time, I guess I have a faith in humanity that I think that will sort of come back and help us. I don't think it's going to hurt us. So once you've made your award decision, if you're going down the totally electronic pathway, then you send them a kind of a follow-up to close out the process. Oh, and by the way, I always put a deadline on when the appeals can happen, because we're in this like song that never ends with the process of admissions and financial aid. It's like just seems to be going forever. I would put a really specific time frame on appeals. If you have new applicants that are appealing and you don't have a ton of time to do this, and the contracts are due by Friday, issuing extensions on the contracts I found was really helpful and less stressful on parents. But don't give it sort of this open-ended situation where you need to be done by this, and set the appeal meeting with your appeal committee of 1 or 5 or whatever. Just get it done very quickly and try to get that stuff closed out. So it's not just sort of this open-ended timeline thing. And maybe that's even something you put on your website, that your appeal process is this, and this is the timeline, and this is what it has to be done by. And even in that welcome letter, like, hey, come fill out this form, making sure you maybe put in some deadline dates. It has to be done by Friday, whatever. If you are denying them additional financial assistance because the appeal was frankly bogus, or it just wasn't appropriate, or it was clear they're just kind of pushing and trying to make a deal, then in that case, you can deny it, right? You can, and that's going to be a very difficult email and a difficult conversation. And then I think depending on the family, and you guys will know, a long-term family, I think that probably may warrant a phone call to tell them that the committee determined that they did not qualify for additional assistance, and maybe give a little bit more detail. For a newer family, I think the more you can kind of nip it and just say, yep, sorry, I mean, we did a review, and I know that things feel pretty stressful right now, but there's no additional financial assistance you qualify for. And with some families, they're going to be upset. And for other families, I think they appreciate the fact that it's fair and it's equitable and it's across the board. And we don't treat you any different than we treat any other family. And this is just, it is what it is in that way. And so I think you'll know your audience to know whether or not that's gonna work. And then the last thing I was going to just quickly talk about, we've got, we go through 11:45. Is that what we're doing through?
Yes, we got 10 more minutes.
Okay, fabulous. I try to time myself out so I give enough time for questions if there is any. So I threw this in here as just I don't know, any of you that know me, I'm going to be sending you sample forms, sample documents, a link to a Google Sheet you can steal and take and do whatever you need to do. Because I think you just don't have enough time to do all these amazing things that we recommend. And that was one of my stresses when I would when I worked at NEIS. It was amazing, except I always felt like I was like the grim reaper of data, and I would be delivering all these like bad news situations, like, oh, that everything's on the decline, this is happening, financial aid is on the increase, and I'm like, okay, and have a good day. I'm like, well, what do we do? Like, what can we turn this around? Like, are you telling me I should get in a different industry? So one of the things I really wanted to do in this career was to make sure that while I can share with you lots of things that are happening that potentially are not great news, I want to also make sure that I'm giving you any samples of things that I'm using. You know, maybe they're good, maybe they're bad, but at least you have a baseline. I don't think anybody went to school to do this for a living. And so I think it's important to kind of share our resources with one another, particularly now where we're kind of in uncharted territory. So this is just something at the end of my season with schools, again, end of season, isn't that a joke? But at the end of the season, I try to kind of do a quick wrap up of, where did we land? And I just usually do a year end, what happened last year versus what happened this year between new and returning families. This is, again, you guys are Excel gurus, very simple Excel spreadsheet based on data I pull from either the financial aid platform or the SIS, whatever data points you got, pull it out, run a year over year. As a treasurer of a school, I found this really helpful. And it was easy to share with the board. There's nothing all complicated about it. It doesn't render 65,000 follow-up questions. It's straightforward. And then I also, because I had some schools where we did offer COVID aid again, because it was an area of the country that was maybe hard hit by the travel industry, and travel was like a big portion of their population. And we did do quite a bit of COVID aid and giving some statistics on what that looked like. Now, you'll notice on this particular case, it was obviously the vast majority of it was for returning families, and then we did some for the new families. I would say, just to be clear, there were very few actually new families that we did offer COVID aid to, because we just tried our best to just help them, power through, give them the 10-month payment plan, and try to have them not fall down this pathway of needing a little bit of financial assistance if we knew they weren't going to qualify. A lot of the new applicants were simply siblings, right? New to the school, not a new family. So I don't want you to think we were doing a lot of COVID aid this year to new applicants. I didn't suggest a ton of that, but particularly with siblings is where we saw a lot more of that. So the year over year and just and I don't know what to call it anymore, because we have, because we are doing COVID aid, sometimes we have these other programs. So I started calling this like financial assistance. I just started calling traditional aid. So that might be helpful for non-financial aid people on your board that, we use a lot of terms that we think are sort of universal, and they're not. Oftentimes I'll say, when the EFC and the DNQ and this and that, people are like, what are you talking about? And oh yeah, that's right. I'm not talking to my people. I'm talking to the general layperson that doesn't do this for a living. And so the traditional aid will kind of be clear, and then your COVID aid. So I thought I'd just throw that in there as sort of just something to check out. And last but not least, I worked with a lot of schools this year, and I could just see the trauma that you were put through. And certainly as a third party, I had my own, I had kids that were home, and it was awful, right? We all suffered through a lot. But there was one universal theme, I think, with school people that maybe even, I'm going to just say, was better than other industries, but our ability to adapt and function and support one another was unbelievable. And I got to see it from above because I had all these different schools, and I think everybody just felt like they were surviving. And I don't think we say thank you often enough to business officers and CFOs and admission, everybody, because people thank their teachers, for all the great things they did for their children. They thank the head of school sometimes, but the people doing a lot of this heavy lifting and in changing the trajectory of children's lives are those in the middle, like all of us people that are just doing all the hard work behind the scenes, making the tough decisions. And so as a parent of 2 independent schools and a treasurer for a board, if you're not thanked enough, I want to thank you for all that you do, because it is such a massive amount of work. And that's just the financial aid piece. And you have, I don't know, HR, this and that, and parking lot duty, everything else that, and running your own families. And so I just want to thank you on behalf of all parents and on behalf of all board people. And so for the holiday break, I got my school's wine mugs. Not that I'm suggesting everybody just start drinking heavily, but maybe you could just use it for soda. I got the mugs that just said getting shit done, because I just felt like every school just said, we're going to figure this out. And so while I can't give mugs to everybody, I just want you to know that you have been getting shit done, and I appreciate it. Now, I'm from Boston, so I do swear a lot, but I'm trying to work on that because I have young children. But that's all I've got for you guys. So I'll take this off and answer any questions you have, or if that's enough information to last a lifetime, that's fine too.
Lisa, it's Martha. I have a question, and I'm going to put you on the spot, but it was something we were talking about before we let people in. Are you seeing anything different in California versus, because you work with schools nationwide, you have to be based here. Are you seeing any different kinds of trends that we should be aware of in California?
I would say in California, and I would say probably more specifically Los Angeles, there are declines in enrollment, which I don't know if that answers your, you probably know that, but I could tell that we were receiving fewer applications for financial aid, and I was seeing budgets having to be dropped, right? Because obviously our enrollment sort of dictates, in some ways, for some schools, that dictates the financial aid budget. And I saw, and I think this was probably, we all heard about it, but this sort of mass exodus from California, though, again, I don't know where they mass exited to, maybe my city, because I can't buy a house. But there was a lot of movement that happened, leaving California to go to Texas, So I have schools in Georgia, in Texas, and in California. And my schools in Georgia were like, we can't handle this. There's all these applications coming in. We don't know what's going on. They're all coming from California. So I got to even see like the end, where they were going, though we know it because, everybody, CNN, everybody's running polls on where people are moving to. But I really, in other parts of the country, I saw a large increase in applicants and in financial aid applicants as well, because that was sort of part of the new, existing public school family. But I did see that enrollment overall, just generally enrollment was down, with the exception of preschools. I thought preschools were going to be dead in the water after last year, what was happening, and they couldn't get these kids in school. And I have a 6-year-old, so I can totally appreciate the fact that my kid needs to be out of this house, and you can't just sit him in front of Zoom. I found that was, I was very worried about my preschools. But once we were sort of able to open, or we could get waivers, it was like gangbusters. I have most of my schools that have got the early childhood ECE programs in California, they're all full. with wait lists for days, which we haven't seen, and I haven't seen in a while. I mean, we know people are having fewer children, and I can't imagine it's COVID babies because that's too early. And I'm not sure. I think we're gonna have more COVID divorces than COVID babies, but that's just my prediction. But yeah, that would be. I think that's the number one thing I saw. Refinancing was universal, and yeah, I think it was fairly universal there. Everything else. I hope that helps.
Thanks. Anybody else? Questions? You can unmute yourself. We're small enough, or put it in the chat. Good.
So either I've freaked everybody out, or hopefully you feel like you have a process in place that you can just adapt. And I already sent it to Martha. I sent the copy of the presentation. I sent the Google Sheet link, the fake one that I created. I sent a sample, thank you for appealing, a letter, a denial of appeal, an approval of an appeal. And I think I sent one of, a financial aid policy sample, like a sample policy guide. So you guys can just take what you need. If there's something that you're like, gosh, do you have a sample, whatever. I also updated my COVID protocols on like what I did. I think last year I did a presentation for you guys on like what code protocols I did. I updated that, but I'm just hopeful that we don't need like full on COVID protocols going forward. So I want to just keep this in sort of a looking forward, next normal situation. But if you want something like that, let me know and I can send you a copy of it.
That's great. And we'll get those posted after the conference on the website, and you'll have access to them. So.
Martha, I have a comment.
Okay.
One thing I noticed this year was just an enormous amount of high income people applying. And I'm talking, I mean, for the North Bay area, I am talking people over the $400,000 or $500,000 mark, even up to the $900,000 mark in the North Bay. So I noticed a lot of those increases, which unfortunately were nice because to me, those were easy denials. And then one other thing, Elisa, that we use that helps kind of curb the appeals is we'll request bank statements. And so those families,
yeah, people don't want to give bank statements.
Those that truly need to appeal will supply those bank statements. Those that are like, I don't think so, we know they can afford it, and that helps clear out a lot of the appeals.
I love to say you can't unring that bell. You can't change your bank statement. So
exactly,
we see what we see. You can't really change that. That's a great recommendation. I try to reserve that for the most egregious of situations where I know they're hiding money somewhere and I just can't get my fingers on it. That's the one I do. Oh, let's see. Do we have a question here?
Kathy, I had a similar situation. Hillbrook had a ton of no award letters that we sent, and we kind of, I was like, why are these people applying? They're making, over $500,000. What are they thinking? Or our documentation must not be good on our website. But our board chair felt like it was a success because they felt comfortable, because a lot of what we've been trying to do is make it more inclusive and approachable, and so while we kind of thought it was a loss, to give all these no award letters, the board chair felt like it was a success. So yeah. I thought that was kind of interesting.
One last thing we've done, this is our third year in a row now. We've got the tuition aid calculator on our website. So granted, it has a little caveat that, we take all these different things into consideration, but we also noticed a lot less hits this year than in prior years. So we do have that tuition aid calculator, and then probably because open house wasn't on campus, it was remote, so it really couldn't be promoted as much. But that has helped out in prior years, I think, for families to feel more comfortable with applying.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kathy.
They're hard because you want to have 75 asterisks too. Because then people are like, I was on your website and you said that if I make this much, yeah, but you have like $8 million in the bank. Like that's a little bit different than the Joe Schmo regular guy that has this much. It's so hard because of the caveats. But I think higher ed, I worked in higher ed for 10 years before I went to K-12, and they seem to be just a couple of years ahead of us in what the trends that we see. And they struggled too with the calculator because it's just like so many variables. But I think schools you probably have done a great job with this. A certain amount of schools have just done a really good job of keeping it detailed, but high level enough that you protect yourself.
I hate to do this, But
Yep,
I'm going to have to end this because we could talk about this for a long time, but I actually have to go open the other session. But Elisa's going to be back tomorrow. So we have another crack at her. And
but it's a repeat performance. I hope you didn't expect me to come.
no,
I have no more
that's true, but you know, people may need to hear it again.
Or just come at the end for questions. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you guys so much. Have a
so
wonderful
much.
day.
Thank you, Elisa. Good to see
Bye,
you.
guys.